fresh tussle between Russia and US, but this time Ukraine is not the issue. Russia issued a firm response over the potential deployment of US missiles in Germany. TASS reported that Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Alexander Grushko has warned of a response if missiles are indeed deployed. Grushko said Russia will create equally or even more effective counter-force capabilities. He added that Russia will act taking into account its national interests and security. The Russian Deputy Foreign Minister said Moscow is ready to discuss with US the issue of missile deployment in Germany. He also added that when the Americans withdrew from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the first thing we did was to declare a moratorium on the deployment of such missiles. We said that we will not deploy such systems as long as American systems are not deployed to Europe. What Europe is now doing is trying to build security against Russia, Grushko emphasized further. The issue dates back to July 2024. The US and Germany had agreed that the Americans would, by 2026, temporarily deploy to Germany a multi-domain task force comprising a mid-range capability battery and a long-range hypersonic weapon battery, as well as other units for air defense, intelligence, and electronic warfare. In November last year, the State Department approved a massive $3.2 billion missile deal with Germany. The deal could see RTX sell Berlin 173 Standard Missile 6 Block 1 missiles, 577 Standard Missile 2 Block 3 missiles, associated launchers, related equipment, and US contractor logistical support. US missiles will improve Germany's capability to meet current and future threats by providing integrated air and missile defense capabilities. Previously, Germany also expressed interest in procuring the Typhoon missile system from the US. If Berlin gets Typhoon missiles, this would break a 3-decade-long absence of long-range strike systems from Europe's armies, but implications for European security and transatlantic relations may follow. All this comes amid Europe fearing threats from Russia. The 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty prohibited both the US and the Soviet Union from fielding ground-launched missiles with ranges of 500 to 5,500 kilometers. The mighty Russian military possesses a broad arsenal of cruise and ballistic missiles, which it has used extensively in its aggression against Ukraine. In addition, it also has S-400 Triumph's long-range surface-to-air missile systems and K-300P Bastion P supersonic anti-ship missiles, along with several other deadly weapons. The weaponry can hold NATO assets at risk over several hundred kilometers, giving Russia the ability to hinder NATO forces from accessing areas along the eastern flank. Europe's deteriorating security environment has led NATO allies to acknowledge the importance of long-range conventional weapons in establishing a credible defense and deterrence posture against Russia. France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Sweden, the Netherlands, and UK have agreed to develop systems under the European Long-Range Approach, RESA. But at present, the US possesses long-range standoff systems that can be launched from land.
Russia has expelled a German diplomat in a tit-for-tat move, escalating diplomatic tensions between Moscow and Berlin. The Russian Foreign Ministry said it had declared a diplomatic employee of the German embassy in Moscow persona non grata, calling the decision a symmetrical response to Germany's expulsion of a Russian official last month. Berlin had accused the Russian diplomat of acting as a spy handler linked to an espionage case. Moscow has firmly rejected the allegation, dismissing it as baseless and accusing Germany of fueling what it called a climate of spy mania. German Foreign Minister Johann Wadepool condemned the move as completely unacceptable, saying Russia was relying on escalation and espionage under the guise of diplomacy. Wadepool confirmed that the expelled German official was part of the embassy's military attaché staff and warned that Berlin reserves the right to take further action. The diplomatic clash comes amid widening divisions within Europe over how to deal with Moscow. While France and Italy have pushed for reopening dialogue with Russian President Vladimir Putin, Germany has doubled down on its opposition to direct talks. Berlin argues that Russia continues to repeat maximalist demands and shows no genuine willingness to negotiate, even as it carries out sustained attacks on Ukrainian civilian and energy infrastructure. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has also voiced skepticism, insisting pressure and sanctions must be maintained and intensified until Moscow changes course. But Moscow is pushing back sharply against Germany's position. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov accused Chancellor Merz of preparing Germany for war, pointing to Berlin's decision to lift constitutional limits on military spending in order to become Europe's leading military power. Lavrov also questioned the behavior of France and the United Kingdom, saying European leaders cannot spend years portraying Russia as weak and collapsing, only to now claim it poses an imminent military threat. He mocked European rhetoric, suggesting leaders should show a little more imagination when trying to convince voters, accusing them of fear-mongering without consistency. According to Lavrov, Europe has instead fallen into what he described as its own political trap, isolating itself while publicly debating dialogue it is unwilling to pursue. Lavrov also took aim at French President Emmanuel Macron, calling his repeated hints that he might call President Putin an example of miserable diplomacy. He insisted that if a European leader truly wants a serious conversation, Moscow has never refused contact, adding that President Putin will always pick up the phone.
Macron announced yet again about 2 weeks ago that he might call Putin sometime. You know, that's not serious, it's pathetic diplomacy. If you want to call and have a real conversation, just call. Putin will always answer the phone. He'll always listen to any proposal. And if serious proposals are on the table, I can assure you that they won't go without a serious, concrete, practical response. I won't hide it. We do have contacts with some European leaders. They call us and ask that these conversations not be made public. Some even show up here and communicate through back channels. But nothing they tell us about their ideas in these closed confidential exchanges differs in any way from what they say publicly. The same appeals. Let's wrap this up. Something has to be done. They just kept saying the same things. Let's bring it to a close. Let's do something. I don't see Europe taking up any real position. They've walked into their own trap by adopting this uncompromising stance that I mentioned earlier, when they insisted on Russia's strategic defeat, saying Ukraine cannot lose, Russia cannot win, or else Europe loses face.
Recently, the Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz, said that Russia is the largest country in all of Europe. And then he went on to make it sound as if he's inviting Russia to be back of the European community. But this is the same man who just recently seemed to almost be wanting to go to war with Russia. What did you make of his comments?
В данный момент многие европейские.
Over the past month and a half, many European politicians have been talking about relations with the Russian Federation. Until recently, they spoke in unison, demanding firmness, insisting on unwavering support for Ukraine, continued arms shipments, sustained financing, all to ensure Russia's defeat, a strategic defeat on the battlefield. Then they changed their tune. They realized it was all an illusion. Their planners, their military strategists who had orchestrated this operation, who had prepared Ukrainians to fight and die advancing European interests against Russia, they finally understood that these plans had collapsed. No one had learned anything from history. Napoleon's attempt, Hitler's attempt, and once again they rallied practically all of Europe under those same banners. Only this time, unlike Napoleon and Hitler, not yet as soldiers on the battlefield, but as donors, sponsors, arms suppliers, ideological leaders. Under those same banners, the Ukrainian army was thrown into battle alongside mercenaries from various countries and official NATO instructors. We all know about this. And this latest attempt has led to the same outcome as Napoleon's and Hitler's misadventures. But the West learns history poorly. We see this especially in Germany, which you mentioned. After several relatively quiet years under Angela Merkel, followed by that rather murky period under Chancellor Scholz, Friedrich Merz came to power and made some striking statements that deserve some serious consideration. He announced that he was lifting constitutional restrictions on military spending, then declared this was necessary for Germany to once again, I emphasize that word, once again, become Europe's dominant military power. This speaks volumes about his mindset and the direction of his thinking. Since then, he has repeated this idea in various forms and in practice. What he's doing amounts to preparation for war. The same thing has been happening in France, where President Macron has repeatedly insisted that Ukraine cannot lose. I won't even get into what the British under Starmer, or of course Ursula von der Leyen and Mark Rutte. Yes, Merz recently said something about Russia being Europe's largest country. Let me correct that right away. Russia is the largest country in Eurasia, not just Europe, and indeed the world. But what concerns us here is Eurasia as a continent. Every attempt so far to establish security in this space has focused exclusively on the western part of Eurasia, so-called Europe. All these security frameworks have been built around the Euro-Atlantic concept. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance. The Americans never wanted to leave the Europeans on their own, and they still don't. They simply want Europeans to foot the bill for their own military preparations and buy American weapons. But lose oversight of their NATO allies? Washington has no intention of that. Then came the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which symbolised the shift from Cold War to peaceful coexistence, equality, consensus, decisions made only by mutual agreement, and much more. That the OSCE has completely discredited itself hardly needs saying now. Everyone can see it. Back when the Soviet Union was collapsing and the Warsaw Pact was dissolving, there were voices saying NATO should be disbanded too, that instead of NATO and the Warsaw Pact, we should strengthen the OSCE as our collective framework based on an honest, equal balance of interests. They remember that now. It never happened, of course, because neither the United States nor Britain nor other leading NATO members had any intention of dissolving the alliance. Instead, they embraced what Francis Fukuyama called the end of history. The end of history, liberal ideology would reign, democracy in its Western form, NATO as the universal guarantor of security. Now, that would dominate. This psychology naturally led to the current situation. But as the Euro-Atlantic structures weakened, I'll note parenthetically that the European Union has also become a NATO appendage. They even signed a document to that effect. Germany began reasserting itself, and this alarms not only us, but many EU member states. Opposition is growing, along with determination not to let Germany once again subjugate everyone else, especially since Merz and his government openly link this German revival to militarization and war preparation. Their defense minister, Pistorius, keeps pointing out to 2029 to 2030 as the deadline by which they must be ready for war with Russia. I don't know who they're trying to convince that Russia would actually attack them. Knowing history should be enough to keep such foolish notions out of your head. But consider the arguments we hear from Europeans. Russia is weakened. Russia is barely advancing across Ukrainian territory. Russia gains a teaspoon of land per day. Russia is failing. Fifth year of war and so on. Massive losses. Russia is struggling, forced to overcome gaps in various weapons systems, or so they write. They paint this picture for their voters of a militarily and economically exhausted Russia, then immediately, with no logical bridge whatsoever, leap to the conclusion that we must prepare for the same Russia to attack us. If you're going to portray us as a broken, depleted country, at least have enough imagination to manipulate your voters more elegantly.